Okay. Hello, everyone. This is the SIG Testing meeting. Today is April 17th, 2018. Um, what is on our agenda today? Looks like we have conversation about node performance benchmarking. Um,
Yeah,
Connor, are you here? Yeah.
yeah, I am. Hi.
Yeah. Floor is yours.
Okay, cool. Let's see. Let me share the doc. So we've written kind of like a one sec. Let me share and then I'll give some background. Okay, thumbs up if you can see things. Cool. Um, yeah. So that basically this came out of the recent resource management working group face-to-face meeting that happened last month, um, March 29th and 30th. It was hosted by NVIDIA. We kind of like started with a retrospective of what we had done in the last year, and kind of like a lot of the recent performance isolation and low-level support for performance-sensitive applications work in the kubelet was driven out of that working group, and then kind of um, you know incubating features that got offloaded to SIGs for code ownership. Most of that stuff went to SIG node, but stuff like CPU pinning and support for pre-allocated huge pages, device like accelerator plugins, it all kind of like started in conversations in that group. And there are some more proposals that are on the backlog, but we kind of came to the consensus in that forum that we've reached the point that even engineers that have done a lot of performance optimization work in the past are having trouble holding in their head like what the prospective impact on performance would be for any given feature that's being proposed without having access to data. And so this is just about like kind of codifying engineering due diligence and making it easier to provide evidence of the benefits of any future proposed low-level node performance features. So to that end, there's really two goals, right? One is to detect regressions for different kind of like vertical workloads that vendors and users care about. So certain classes of performance sensitive, like high performance networking, machine learning training is another one that's come up a lot. So there's kind of like certain use cases that users are kind of who are pushing for these features are using. So it'd be great to kind of like get some representation of that in a performance test suite that we could use to detect regressions over time. So for example, if like 1.11, if it makes this workload run 20% worse, it would be nice if we knew ahead of time. And then the other part is kind of, as I said, which is to help us to prioritize and evaluate the effect of future performance improvements. So that's really what this document is about. It's not very prescriptive about like where the code goes or the testing infrastructure or anything like that. That was kind of like the next step coming out of the resource management work group, was to just raise this topic within the SIG testing forum and try to get some feedback, some guidance, and kind of like help us along. So with that brain dump, is there any feedback? I've already talked to Tim St. Clair, who's on the line, so I've got his thoughts already, but open to anything that anyone else can think of that would be a good place to start. Concretely, we're thinking about like, initially just for ease, maybe adding a subdirectory in test node E2E, and then having it not run as part of the default set, but letting users run it themselves, and then worry about like integrating it into some periodic performance regression detection thing. Does that make sense?
It does. So, sorry that I missed the opening part of this. Help me understand how much of the performance impact here would be affected by the container engine that the kubelet uses versus, I'm trying to understand like what kinds of performance impacts changing features you're talking about here, I guess. Because to
Oh,
me,
okay. So, yeah, so some examples would be, you know, I guess I listed a few before, but one is the CPU pinning or CPU affinity feature that was added. It's currently in beta. That thing is implemented such that you could add more policies. And so really to get any sort of signal about the effectiveness of like a more autopilot like policy, we would want to run it against a suite of you know, well-known workloads. There's also the question of NUMA, or kind of like low-level device topology aware resource allocation within the kubelet. So right now we have a, you know, device manager subsystem that lets you use a device plugin that kind of like helps with the kind of like setup and allocation of devices to a container. So some things like GPUs, that's the way that the support is moving. FPGAs, specialized hardware, like if you have a, you know, InfiniBand or, you know, something like that. So those two features just by themselves, you know, you can use them in isolation, but if you're on a multi-socket system and you enable both features, you're not guaranteed that you're going to be pinned to a CPU on the same NUMA node as your device that was allocated, for example. So that's one thing that's kind of on the horizon that we want to be able to test and see, like, you know, for different workloads, what is the actual impact of the problem and how many people are we going to help by implementing this in the next way.
and I guess that's where I'm trying to understand if we're talking about node level changes impacting cluster level workloads, or if you're talking about, because to me, when I'm just reading through the doc, I'm not sure. When I think of node testing, I think of testing a single node in isolation as opposed to a workload that I hand to a cluster. Maybe my terminology is confused.
Yeah, so this is really about application performance as a function of like new features in the kubelet. So not multi-node, but, you know, on a single node, maybe you have like, you know, an application whose performance you care about a lot. And, you know, if you want to kind of like pressure it by adding some aggressors, like something that uses a lot of cache or something that uses a lot of memory bandwidth, for example, for streaming workload. That would be a way to kind of like tease out, like, in what situations do these performance optimizations help? But anyway, we want to make sure that they keep working and that the applications that are represented in the test suite continue to run better and better on future versions of Kubernetes.
How many of the hardware topologies that you want to test are available, like from cloud providers and whatnot, and to what extent do you need actual hardware to test them?
Yeah, that's kind of a tricky one. You know, so for multi-socket, GCP, as far as I know, last time we checked, it doesn't support, or it doesn't report multiple NUMA nodes. So even their biggest machine is just, you know, one like logical socket. You know, so, you know, we don't have to get everything in the first step. If we can start somewhere and then kind of like iterate, that would be fine. Over time, it would be good to maybe extend, you know, a lot of these features are really kind of intended for the bare metal use case. So if we could get some bare metal machines in a different testing infrastructure, that would be cool. But, you know, we don't necessarily expect like CNCF or Kubernetes to provide all the infrastructure. But as a place to host the code, it would be kind of nice if it was upstream. But like I said, open to all sorts of opinions at this point. It's kind of wide open.
At the CNCF CI, at least, Packet is an option, and that's like more or less bare metal, right? So there should be some way of wiring in something. Not saying that you know, it should be too disruptive, but you know, Amazon first and foremost would have VMs that supports like multi-socket. So there should be a path forward. Just a side comment.
Okay, so that all makes sense to me. Like this totally seems like a good path, a good idea to do. I guess the other thing that jumps out to me is metrics collection. So I would really love for somebody to correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we have the greatest support for metrics collection in our tests tools today. So one example would be the scalability tests. They measure like CPU and memory usage, I think, but that's some like hard-coded thing that lives somewhere in the test E2E package. We don't support something nice like continuously scraping a given set of Prometheus metrics into some kind of file that could be exported and then imported into something later. And I feel like that's going to be the larger hurdle that you may have to overcome. But like, does anybody know?
There's a, a performance group at Red Hat led by Jeremy Eder, who has a whole suite of tests they call PerfBench that is all open and very full featured that they're using to create some pretty impressive data visualizations. So that might be an option there.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. We're in touch with Jeremy frequently, so I'll just ask him about it.
Okay, cool. And then the other thing that jumps out to me is looking at storing the test results in, I don't know that our testing infrastructure doesn't directly store test results in protobuf format in GCS. We store test results in GCS as like JSON files or XML files, machine parsable stuff, and then there's a separate job that goes through and scrapes GCS and converts that into data that then gets scraped by something else. It puts it into BigQuery, and then something else scrapes BigQuery and converts that into protobuf data that test grid serves out. So all that to say, like, human readable but machine parsable data is kind of the expected artifact format, and then the rest of the jiggery can take it from there.
So how does the order go again? It goes from JSON or XML or something, and then goes into BigQuery and then becomes protobuf?
Yes.
Yeah, in particular, we have a job that reads all the new test results from GCS and imports those into BigQuery, and then whatever needs that can use it. So if you did have a small amount of metrics, you can only have about 1 meg of data per build. That can get imported into BigQuery, or we can do some other method. And the performance group, like the scalability group, already collects some metrics for their scale tests, and those I think are just stored as JSON right now, and they have their own dashboard that will graph them and everything.
Yeah, that's the PerfTest dashboard, but that's like I'm cautioning against using that as an extensible.
Yeah, totally. But sticking to JSON and XML for external formats, just so they're easier to be parsed by whatever tools, is probably a better idea.
Yeah, so if you want to take a look at the code that's responsible for converting that JSON and stuffing it into BigQuery, look for Kettle in the test info repo. Kubernetes extract test results, transform and load engine or something.
Like KETTL?
Yeah, KETTLE. I can post a link in Zoom chat.
All right, that'd be cool. Thank you. Is there like an overview, like doc, on kind of how the data flows?
Yeah.
Everyone's posting links to the docs faster than me. I don't have a great overview doc, but I think somewhere I'm looking in maybe the Kubernetes README kind of talks about the expected file format that things should be posted into GCS. But I don't know that we have something that concisely describes how things flow from one place to another.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so, but in general, just kind of like at a high level, people think it's a sane thing to do and same thing to fit into the node E2Es. And then the rest is figuring out the machinery.
Do the tests look like canonical EDEs? Are they similar?
It could be.
Yeah, I mean, if you're getting a lot from that framework, that seems like the best place to put it. I think people that are trying to write EDE-like things outside of Kubernetes end up either trying to copy or vendor stuff, and it's not always very pretty right now.
mean, this area of where the code should live and what's the best framework type pattern to use for it is something I would expect Tim St. Clair to have a much stronger opinion on, and stuff that I would view as falling under the purview of the testing commons sub-project of this SIG. So like,
we've already chatted. Like he's pretty much. I gave him a couple of different options.
Okay.
You know, there's the question that I posed towards him is how many people are going to watch this signal? How is it going to block? Just because we have tests in test grid and we actually even get the data up there doesn't mean that it blocks things and people even watch it. So having the signal and having the right watchers, I think, is the important part too. The logistics matter.
they do, but that's a problem that literally still the release team needs to find a better way to solve. And I know
this totally segues into my next topic too.
I know I'm still somewhat on the hook to document this, but it's kind of a crawl, walk, run thing where first let's make sure we can actually get the data into test grid, and then we'll make sure we have humans watching it, and then we'll make sure we have the machinery to enforce all this stuff. But right now we don't have a whole bunch of that documented very concisely outside of like a Google Doc that I have linked from an issue that is probably marked as stale by Betabot by now in the release repo about, you know, documenting what it takes to move to introduce new tests, call them blocking, and make sure they remain, like what criteria they have to meet to be blocking, and then how often we should verify that they're still meeting those criteria in terms of test duration and flakiness and ownership and responsiveness of those owners to test failures and things like that. I mean, I was just mainly interested in like mechanically how would this work living outside of the repo, more as a maybe an update from you, Tim, in terms of like where you would see this heading.
I think having it as part of the node end-to-end tests, it logistically makes sense so long as it's run and there's signal. You can always just run any test apparatus external to core, and you'll probably get higher fidelity if you're on the hook to own that piece. I think in reality, I mean, that's what everyone else does. I see Steve nodding his head because I know that's what OpenShift does, right? And I do the same thing too. So it matters for who's the consumer and who are the owners and who are the consumers of the data.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the issues is that it's meant to be kind of shared responsibility, although that's kind of a bad term nobody likes. But yeah, a shared ownership, let's say, you know, any sort of like feature owner for one of these performance features should be interested in maintaining the test, and they're from a bunch of different organizations.
Yeah, and logistically, we've had a problem with like maintaining ownership, right? And I think that goes back to what Aaron was saying. Is like we need somebody who's going to be the watcher on the wall if we're going to promote this over time.
I can tell you like the human-oriented process I put together when I was CI signal lead for a release a little while back, which was step one, which we do enforce, is make sure that every job that runs a suite of tests is owned by some SIG. So it should show up on some SIG's dashboard somewhere. So for example, SIG scalability owns the performance-related jobs. So it's their responsibility to respond if those jobs go from green to red, assuming they stay green. But then all of the individual test cases in, say, like the correctness job that makes sure that Kubernetes is behaving like a Kubernetes at 5,000 nodes, they don't code any of those features. So each of those individual test cases are owned by the SIG that's responsible for that feature. And so it's kind of their job to go say, hey, you know, SIG network or whatever, like your new proxying feature isn't working at scale, you need to fix it at scale. Like it might be your test might be working totally fine in AWS and in small scale in GCE, but it's really broken at high scale. And so you kind of, that's the shared responsibility in terms of you have like a watcher on the wall as a SIG to watch the job, but the person responsible for owning the feature itself or the thing that's actually being tested will generally own the test case. We don't really have machinery around automating this sort of notification of people, but in practice as a human, when I was applying this to jobs and tests that were blocking the release from going out the door, it tended to work. And it's like, it's dumb enough that I think it could be converted into something automated. But I mean, how does that sound?
Yeah, I think that it makes sense to me.
And so in that sense, I would view kind of SIG node as probably responsible for, the performance at the node level and making sure that it's good, but they'll probably be responsible for routing the appropriate issues to the SIGs responsible for implementing that given feature.
Okay. So is that something that you're working on codifying more, or?
I mean, I haven't written up in a doc, and I'll work it with the current CI signal person to see if we can follow the convention is basically just make sure that the SIG responsible for the feature shows up in brackets in the test name. It's very stringly typed, but most of the test cases follow that pattern today. There are very few that don't, and so we can start with that for now. Like I personally feel the amount of time it's going to take you to get reliable test data and a meaningful enough signal to even block anything is probably in the 112 time frame, by which time I would hope we would have something more enforceable in place in terms of defining what blocks and doesn't, right? So for example, what I have advocated for in the past and release teams have never done is say we are literally not moving forward in the release schedule until all of the tests on this dashboard are green. What we've always traditionally done is cut builds even though all the tests might be failing, which means alphas and betas go out the door at a predictable schedule, but we literally have no idea how functional they are. And then we start chasing that game when it comes to actually cut release candidates and go through a burn down and whatnot. So what the release team is trying this time as a carrot instead of a stick is to say, if you can get your tests passing, we will freeze later so that ideally if things are stable, we don't have to go into a code freeze in order to stabilize everything. But if things look unstable, we're going to have to continue to have this lengthy code freeze process to pay attention to this.
I want to somehow, even bring this back to steering at some point and talk about what are the metrics by which we cut a release and actually block a release, because we've never blocked a release, as you mentioned, and this is part of my conversation topic for today on red signal, right? We have a bunch of tests that are still non-functional, and I have to go through and take ownership whether I want to or not for some signal, because we have product that went out that has problems, right? Because every .0 release of Kubernetes, and I know Justin's not looking at the camera, but he can probably nod vigorously that every .0 release we've ever had has been a steaming pile of awful. And we fixed the problems almost really, really fast as soon as it got out the door, right? And I really don't want to keep on doing this. It's kind of pathological.
Please help the release team, and please advocate that the release team actually have the power to delay the release schedule if the tests aren't passing. I really try to be very diligent about defining how stable should a set of tests be before we decide that, or how flaky should they get before we decide, this isn't meaningful signal. And who should be responsible for saying, no, this feature absolutely must be in the release. And then how does the conversation proceed where it's well, if you want the feature in the release, you actually have to have automated tests that are this reliable to make sure that feature actually works. Otherwise, you are definitely shipping a broken feature. And the release team totally, in my opinion, should have the power to do that. It seems to be more of a product level conversation. And I'm not entirely sure one steering committee member to another. It's not something that I think steering committee has power to enforce. It's something I think rather in our delegating authority to SIG's manner, SIG release should say, no, we're not cutting a release. It's not ready.
Let's give them the power. We arbitrarily can say, let's give them the power.
There is a structural bug in the process, which is that the merge to the next release opens before the release team is decided. So right from the get-go, the release manager can't say you can't put things in. Right? So like right from the get-go, they're behind the ball, aren't they? Is this no longer true?
Can you describe what you mean a little bit there?
So I don't think we've concretely, I don't think we've filled out the 111 team yet entirely.
It
But
is.
the 111 branch is open.
You're right. There's no patch release manager. So the patch release manager would be the person responsible for cutting the .1 release, not the
I don't want to minimize that, but I think, like, is it not the case that the 111 branch opened before the release manager was chosen, or is that not true?
So there is technically no such thing as a 111 branch yet, right? Master is what we're cutting the 111 candidates from.
Before, but we froze master. We stopped PRs going in prior to the release of 110, and then we reopened it, which is what I consider the opening of the 111 branch, as it were.
Okay, that's fair. But the tests weren't even passing when we froze it. You understand that, right? The tests have almost never been passing. It drives me bananas. So, in my opinion, I would much rather have a we ship when it's done, we ship when it's ready schedule. But what seems to be preferred by those who have a more marketing or product-oriented bent is that we ship on a predictable schedule every quarter.
The question that I have a really difficult time answering is it's like this imaginary force that no one can see, but it kind of is pushing the universe. Maybe it's like dark energy, right? The expansion of the universe continues unabated, but like there's no particular person that is doing that pushing. Like it's almost become a pathological thing where we continue down this road because we've done it for so many times, even though like no one is actually doing the pushing, right? Like do we have a single source of who is driving the release drum to make sure that it occurs at a given cadence?
That is a good question, and something I would take up with SIG release rather than SIG testing.
Well, also, once again, the schedule is proposed before the release manager is chosen again.
I think that's so bonkers and bananas, it drives me up the wall. The fact that we had a very well-attended talk at the last KubeCon about how we should change the release schedule and process has been completely swept under the rug, and each release team basically already has a schedule ready to go before we've even done our postmortem. It's bananas. I agree. I get, but I'm trying to suggest maybe this is more of a release-oriented topic as opposed to a testing topic. For like, we provide signal, right? And I think our tools mostly do a good job of that. Now, whether or not the thing that generates the signal is meaningful or not is kind of not entirely our responsibility. If I were to, as somebody who's been a CI signal lead for release before, I think one thing we could do better is make test grid understand a little bit more than it does about test hierarchy. Because like right now, I can go look at a summary dashboard and see perpetually failing test cases that aren't actually, they don't exist anymore. But test grid has some hysteresis. Or like test failures can show up, but the overall test doesn't show up, so I know that I shouldn't actually look at that job. Because the overall job is passing, the failures are leftover residual stuff. So like, there's stuff we could do to provide more of a signal from those results, but ultimately it's the responsibility of the people generating those test results to do stuff with them. Does that make sense? I took us over time with this, sorry. So that's the status quo today. There isn't clear ownership of test suites. I mean, I feel like there is clear ownership. No problem, airports are fun. There is clear ownership of jobs. I just don't think that we, when I held the role as a human, I didn't want to immediately turn on bots to start nagging people automatically on job failures or on test failures, because I believe that history has shown those get ignored. Not always, right? I think when we started filing issues based on the top 10 clusters as denoted by the triage dashboard, 40% of the time, humans actually addressed those. 60% of the time, they aged out. But I just kind of feel like it would be worth continuing to have humans push forward the how do we notify and how do we make this meaningful. It almost, to me, it almost seemed like people paid more attention when I, as a human being, came and bugged them because they trusted that I was a little less noisy than a bot. So until we can figure out a way to make less noisy automated notifications, I still feel like it deserves some tight collaboration with the release team first and foremost, which I'm happy to help with. And it's true, maybe this opens up the possibility of right now, I talked about how a SIG owns a bunch of tests, but for example, we have one job that runs all the tests inside of GCE, and then each individual SIG just like regexes that down to their specific set of tests. And so it could be if SIG, SIG nodes tests flake and cause the whole job to fail, like SIG network doesn't necessarily see that, and it makes the signal noisier for them. So there was a thought at one point in time of why don't we like regex down just the SIG network tests and just the SIG node tests and just the SIG UI tests and stuff. That would create a whole bunch more jobs for us. My personal feeling is that would result in us spending a lot more time standing up clusters and a lot less time doing useful stuff with them. But we've run way over time with this, and the person who originally proposed this topic has now dropped off. I kind of feel like we're done, but I don't know about y'all. Cool. If it's not clear, I am super passionate about this topic just because I tried to push it forward on the release side of things. And so if you want to keep this discussion up, I think the SIG release Slack channel would be a great place, and release team meetings as well. Okay, thank you so much, Steve, for hosting while I rebooted my laptop, because apparently that's just what happens sometimes. Happy Tuesday, everybody.
See you guys.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.